types of persons, and so on. Now, let me go ahead and run through these three kinds. These are ideal types. And so let me just mention that what does that mean to say a stratification system or anything else is an ideal type? It means that it's actually rare that you'll find this thing realized per its kind of strict definition anywhere in the world, right? You'll find kind of rough approximations of these things, right? So a caste system or an estate system or a class system. You'll also find all kinds of intermediate types. So you might run across a system that has a number of the properties listed here as definitive of caste, but then it may also have properties of other kinds of stratification systems, right? So it's saying that the pure definition that we see up here of a caste really exists only in its perfection in the mind of the human being, of the researcher. Okay, so here's the ideal type of a caste system. You might be familiar with this. It's most commonly associated with India. Its properties are probably best realized in ancient India, maybe less so in the India of today, right? So India, actually, today you might have present in Indian society. By Indian society, I mean in Southeast Asia, right? The big peninsular area in Southeast Asia, you'll kind of find a mix of a class system, and a caste system. And you might describe it as there's remnants of the caste system that are still persisting despite kind of the legal imposition of something closer to a class system, as we'll see, okay? So just be aware that the reality, and that's kind of the idea of an ideal type, the reality is almost always going to be much more confusing, complex, and messier than these ideal types by definition would lead you to suppose. So a caste system is often based on a religious belief system. The religious belief system supplies many of, you could say, the building blocks for the system of stratification, for the system of ranks, okay? And once again, it's a hierarchical rank, where you see the bulk of the stuff that's desired, whether it be reputation, good housing, material wealth, and so on and so forth, okay? The bulk of it at the top, and less so as you go down to the bottom, the least at the bottom, okay? By the way, caste, so if you're familiar with caste or heard that word before, just a little aside, historical aside, the word itself, caste, means purity, purification, and that's for good reason that they use that label, because the caste system in India is one at whose center is a preoccupation with ideas of cleanliness, purity versus contamination, pollution, and so forth. Okay, but that word actually comes from the Portuguese, is my understanding. I ran across something that said that the Portuguese traded. Right, they were world-class, world-famous navigators, and they were all over the place in the East Indies, okay? And so they, seeing what they did in Indian society, they spoke of it as one that was all about caste or purity. So in a caste system, here are the properties of this stratification system, ascription. How do you belong? And actually, let me do this really quickly. So the caste system in India traditionally has been made up of these ranks that have different names. So at the very top are Brahmins, the Brahmin class, okay? And notice that they're associated with an occupation. And by the way, in Hindi itself, the word that for these ranks are varnas, which basically means colors, different colors from different classes. But at the top are religious experts, specialists. They know sacred scripture from like these ancient sacred texts, the names of which escape me. I know there's such things as like Upanishads, texts that refer to ancient myths about the creation of the world, the various gods, and all that kind of stuff. So they're the ones who basically spend a lot of time reading and interpreting scripture. And they actually, and then to go on, the Kshatriyas, they're rulers, they're warriors, okay? They're people that protect and lead the society. The Vaishyas would be like landlord, essentially, big owners of land, also merchants and shop owners and the like, right? So kind of like the entrepreneurs and landowners of the society. Shudras are probably the largest segment of the caste system, and they're kind of common laborers. So they might be tenants, okay? They might just commoners, basically. And then at the very outside, they've come to call themselves the Dalit, which basically, I think means, it's a word for people who've been harshed on, basically. They've been reviled, they've been, hammered on and unfairly treated. That's their name for themselves, okay? Kind of the from the outside, they're seen as literally untouchables. Okay, they're outside the caste system altogether. They don't even belong in one of the varnas. Their deal is historic, even still today. And by the way, I should just mention as an aside that there tends to be a difference between the urban centers and the rural areas. So it seemed that it's often observed that the rural areas of today are the places where the caste system retains most of its classic features, or where its classic features are most strongly retained, okay? Where it seems to have kind of held off some of the reform measures. There was actually, as part of the Indian Constitution, when it gained its independence from Britain, of which it was a colony beforehand, in the Constitution and actually in subsequent legislation, there are legal measures, explicit measures to outlaw the caste system, okay, as being basically not worthy of kind of a modern democratic representative democracy, which officially India is, right? They hold election of officials and so on. So, and the caste system is supposed to be, or seen as, at odds, incompatible with that kind of system, okay? For reasons you might kind of ponder yourself. Why would that be? So anyway, these outcasts, here was the deal with them. The outcasts were people to whom was given a lot of the work that was seen as beneath other people to do, beneath people who had caste membership. So work that was seen as dirty or unbecoming. So sweeping streets, anything to do with filth, anything to do with waste, anything to do with excrement and excretions and death and other kinds of kind of challenges or assaults to the body, you could say. So people who basically take care of the funeral processes and the processes of dealing with the dead through cremation. That's been given traditionally to the outcasts. Taking care of and disposing of human waste, for example. A whole host of other kind of labors that are seen as inherently polluting, okay? I think I may have mentioned, I think when we talked about Durkheim, right, there's a whole set of traditional do's and don'ts, how you're supposed to dress, what you're supposed to eat, so on and so forth, that's differently given to different members, different caste members. And there's definite don'ts, okay, proscriptions against contact or interaction between the outcasts, okay, the untouchables, or the Dalits as they call themselves, and caste members. And if these are violated, okay, and especially if they're knowingly or deliberately violated, at least traditionally, the punishments for those violations could be extremely harsh. All right. Okay, that's as much as I'll say about that. So that gives you a picture of the caste system in its traditional form. Okay, these different ranks. How do you become a member of the Brahmins or the Kshatriyas or what have you? It's through ascription. So you got to be born into it. Okay, that's how you gain class membership. Okay, and then there's rules of endogamy. Endogamy means marriage within. Okay, so you're supposed to marry within. It's preferred. Okay, the more so, the higher up you move, so that it's seen as like, I mean, just an absolute, you know, it turns your stomach, the idea of being forced to marry beneath you, a lower rank. Okay, if you're a lower rank, you actually seek to marry up. But the system is such that there are kind of pressures against that. So, you know, at least traditionally, you would mostly marry within. Okay, and so if you think about it, okay, how do you end up within one of these strata? A stratum, right, is one of these levels within that society. Okay, you got to be born into it. Okay, and then you're probably going to marry within it. So that means your children, okay, will inherit your rank. And if you think about it, going through the generations, that means these different ranks, okay, are going to be, they're going to preserve their identity within, as it were, kinship groups, right? It's going to be a very closed system. There's going to be very little movement of groups, of individuals, families, and so on, up in, okay, through these different ranks. Okay, so closedness, closure, or openness is one of the kinds used to describe a stratification system. How much movement up and down the ranks does it tend to allow or encourage or discourage or whatever? And the caste system would be the most closed of the stratification systems, right? And I just mentioned the classic Indian example. And let me just mention the way in which it's based on a religious belief system, okay? So I'm guessing most people have run across two of the most, I guess, well-known features of the Hindu belief system, okay, which is the belief system. And by the way, I'll just mention as an aside, a sort of due acknowledgement of the complexity of history and real life, that the Hindu religion is actually an incredibly multifarious, by which I mean highly, what's the word? There's lots of variety, okay, within the family of Hindu religion, so that, you know, from one region to another, its practices, its beliefs, its gods, and so on, they might vary hugely. Okay, so just be aware of that. Okay, so, but very common is the belief in reincarnation and belief in karma. So reincarnation is this idea that there's this circle of life. It is never ending, okay? To die today is only to transform. It's only to change your form, and then you become reinvigorated. You become revived. You may become a form different from you were in this particular cycle. The cycle of life is never ending, okay? But you actually may change form. And the idea is that you may receive, as it were, a promotion or a demotion, depending on how you've behaved, okay? And the way in which you behaved is recorded, as it were, in the idea of karma, right? You do good things and you build up good karma. You do bad things and you build up bad karma. Now, how to be good or how to be bad in Indian society depends traditionally in good measure on how well you behaved, the do's and don'ts okay, of the caste system? Did you dress and eat and behave and interact like a proper Brahmin or Kshatriya or so on, okay? Or did you not? So here's the idea. The idea is that had you been Kshatriya or Vaishya or Shudras, if you violated, if you stepped across the lines in terms of these do's and don'ts, you may actually in your next life be reborn as an untouchable, right? You may drop down a notch. Okay? And conversely, if you live in unimpeachable kind of existence in terms of abiding by the codes, you may actually move up. Right? Now think about that. Place yourself in that kind of society. And imagine that you actually are one of these untouchables. It's a rough life, okay? It's menial labor. You're looked down upon, and you actually, spend enormous time engaged in drudgery. So at least from the outside, it appears like you live, in misery, forms of misery. And from the outside, you may guess that at times you get upset and you feel like you're fed up with having to put up, okay, with doing society's dirty work, and you feel mistreated. And so wouldn't you want to push back? Wouldn't you want to howl, in righteous indignation about the injustice of it all and say it's not fair and do something about it, right? Now, in fact, the Dalits have, and there are movements, civil rights movements that have been pushing for, greater equality, greater recognition of their legal rights and so on within India. So there is a movement, okay? So things can change, but working against more often. Why do you still have untouchables? And you could say, in part, it's because of the power of this these religious beliefs. Okay, that this combination of of reincarnation, belief in reincarnation, and karma leads you to interpret your lot in life as your just reward. Right? You say to yourself before you howl in indignant, righteousness, you say, well, this is what you get if you didn't act properly in your last life, right? And so what you'll do is you'll just have to hope for something better the next time around. So you can kind of, break against efforts to change the system on a basis of felt injustice, okay, comes from this combination of, the idea of reincarnation and karma, okay, and also the idea of a kind of toleration, the idea that if you just be patient and, obey, stay in your place like you're supposed to, you'll be rewarded further down the road, right? So, and we could talk about how those religious beliefs serve what we might want to call as the ideology of stratification. Okay, so your textbook brings up the idea of stratification ideology, sets of ideas that serve to perpetuate, justify, and make seem reasonable a stratification system, even to those who may not be its beneficiaries. Okay, so that's the caste system. Let me move on to the estate system. This is an intermediate form between caste and class that is not mentioned in your textbook. Okay, and here's how it differs a little bit from the caste system. In some ways, actually, the two are often in real life hard to distinguish one from the other. And I might just mention that the system in the U.S. South prior to and even after the Civil War, in which you had slavery, in which in a way you have a caste system. You have people who literally are ascribed, and even where ascription and endogamy works, at least with regard to the two major categories based on ideas of race, right? Black or African origin enslaved persons, right? And white European descendant, freeborn persons, okay? Basically, you inherit that position, okay? So that's kind of like class. However, you could actually make the case that a stronger basis for that system was provided by political legal codes, by constitutions and state legislation, state level legislation. Okay, but so that's actually a question that people pose, for example, about the kind of pre-Civil War U.S. Southern plantation system. But more classically, there's this, you can turn to like feudal Europe, in which you have these three ranks or strata: the nobility, okay, which were a tiny portion of the population. They were the big landowners, okay? The clergy was another, basically the priests and ministers and cardinals and all of that, okay, religious specialists. And then the vast majority of the population were commoners, okay? Many caste-like features. It's extremely closed, okay? So if you were a commoner, if you were a peasant, okay, for example, in the countryside, in all likelihood, you're going to marry a peasant, okay? 99 times out of 100, that's whom you're going to marry, okay? If you're nobility, you're going to remain within the ranks of the nobility when it comes to marriage. Very rare that you're going to marry a peasant, okay? So now, there was some social mobility in that kind of system, however, more so than in the caste system. And in part, this did have to do with certain kinds of movements of the type we've talked about before. Peasants did show significant unrest at times and actually even take up arms against nobility. And sometimes they found leaders among certain of the ranks of the nobility, the educated and so forth. There's a number of reasons we're not going to enter into, but you did sometimes find, and we'll call that social mobility. So in studies of stratification systems, social mobility means movement of individuals, usually out of their family of origin across the generations. Like they move higher than their parents, or they fall lower than their parents. So usually it's across generations, although you can talk about mobility of an individual themselves as well. Okay. One thing that's actually interesting to consider before moving on to the case of class is to what extent. So if you can find features of caste in an estate system that is very, very closed, okay, most people are still remaining in, okay, the rank into which they were born. Peasant child in, a peasant family, and stays that way. But to the extent you find caste features in an estate system, to what extent do you find estate/caste-like features that appear in a class system? Okay, so, and you can often find, okay, certain, I guess, areas or regions within a class system that begin to assume what appears to be something very much like an estate or caste type configuration. Let's see, moving on then to the class system. So this would be our system. Okay. Now, presumably, okay, so think from a caste system. How do you end up where you are in a caste system? It's through birth. Okay. how do you end up where you are in a class system, which is also a stratification system, okay? So to be a stratification system means there are grades or levels or strata or ranks of whatever feature is desirable, whether it be occupational prestige, whether it be certain kinds of rights or powers, whether it be wealth altogether, right? It's unequally distributed and it increases as you move up, okay? You find that in a class system, okay? Class systems are full of inequalities of various kinds, but where you actually end up in that system is presumably as an ideal type. It's supposed to be not by birth, right? It's not because you were born into a neighborhood, into a family, that you had a certain last name, that you were of a certain religion, that you had a certain complexion of skin, or any other of these kinds of features that, from the point of view of a caste system, are seen as artificial features, artificial barriers, or artificial locational mechanisms. It's supposed to be purely by achievement. Okay, so achievement is supposed to be the motor of location within a class system. Where you end up is based on, so what do we mean by achievement? We mean something you did yourself by your own efforts and on the basis of your own capabilities. Okay? And you're supposed to actually imagine it this way. So there are no more, from the point of view of the class system, what would be seen as artificial barriers to movement that are raised within a caste system or an estate system, okay? So it does not matter what your last name is, where you were born, how tall you are. Any of these kinds of features are not taken as, you know, sort of arbitrary disqualifications to getting somewhere in the caste system. Rather, it's everyone starts at the starting gate. So imagine it that way. You say, on your mark, get set, go. Now use your own natural capacities and apply them as you see fit to trying to get ahead in the race of achieving whatever it is, okay, that are seen as the good things, like a good job, good income, lots of wealth, a nice house, etc., okay? So on your mark, get set, go. And then there's this competitive race, right? And then at some point in time, you say, let's stop and let's see where people are, right? So where you're distributed, where you end up within this caste system is supposed to be based on that, okay? It's this kind of competitive game. That's how, and to that extent, it is supposed to resemble something like a free competitive economic marketplace or market, okay, where everyone competes with everyone else on a kind of equal playing field, okay? The rules apply to everyone in exactly the same way. Now, this word meritocracy, I'm not gonna mention, you know, how it came about. There was this guy named Michael Young. You can look into his story. He actually did something really interesting. He wrote a science fiction-y novel for his doctorate thesis, in which he coined the term, he was an English guy, by the way, he coined the term meritocracy, okay? And meritocracy is essentially a word that literally means rule, okay? Or let's put it this way. So if an aristocracy is where the nobility rule, fine blood rules. If a democracy is where the demos, the people, okay, of whom, within which all individuals are equal, rule, then a meritocracy is a society in which the idea of achievement, okay, and well-earned deserts rules, okay, and so in which those artificial barriers have been removed. And so people ask questions. If you take a look at a society like the United States and you ask a question, to what extent does the United States actually approximate or look like a class system according to its ideal type? Is it a society in which where you end up is based solely, okay? And let's say that you could label these stratas: upper class, upper class, middle class, lower middle class, working class, et cetera, is where you end up purely on the basis of your own capabilities and efforts, or were there other factors that determine that got in the way? Okay, if you can say that, yep, everyone ended up where they were purely on the basis, okay, it was like that, where everyone started at the same place, at the starting line together, okay, and then the rules applied to everyone fairly, and they ended up where they were, okay, based on their own capabilities and efforts. To the extent that that's true, you could say we live in a meritocracy, okay? Wherever you are, whether you're rich or poor, you got there because you deserved it, because that's how hard you worked. Where you end up reflected your efforts. So we live, if that's the case, you could say we live in a meritocratic system. Right? So just giving you that word is it's kind of a useful word to have, because it's a quick way of sort of evaluating, giving an evaluative judgment of the kind of stratification system you live in. So you could ask the question, is watch the documentary, okay, people like us, social class in America, what are they saying? What do the documentarians, the filmmakers, what is their message? Is their message that, yeah, this is a meritocratic society? Or is their message, you know what, we're not nearly the meritocracy that we tell ourselves we are, or that many influential people who sort of have control over the narrative or image of the United States that they like to tell, say that we are. They prefer to think of ourselves as a meritocracy, but maybe we're not. So look, a caste system would not be a meritocracy, right? Not at all. In a state system, you know, in a way you could say a caste system and an estate system are both in, according to a certain definition of the word, aristocracies, meaning rule by the best according to some definition, okay? That is, you were born high, you were born into a family, and therefore by definition you're the best. Okay, best between quotes, okay? From the point of view of a class system, that idea that those on the top are the best because they were born to be such, that's supposed to be seen as, you know, that's just ideology. That's an ideology that justifies that kind of system. Okay, let me finish up here by introducing this kind of work right here. There's a number of interesting questions that you can ask about a class system. Okay, so here's one that was raised by a guy named Max Weber, among other people, but he said, so imagine a class system, and imagine that you fire the starting gun. On your mark, get set, go. Try to end up where you can on the class system. Get as much wealth as you can or whatever, and then you stop at a certain time and you see where people end up. There's people who ended up, you know, 100 people or 100,000 people ended up at the top, 200,000 people that ended up in the middle, and, you know, so on. And what Weber suggests or asks us to consider is whether or not at the very beginning you can have everyone collected together as a collection, as an aggregate of people that ended up in the top tier, and there's nothing that binds them together. There's nothing that they hold in common with each other except for having succeeded in making a certain amount of wealth or attaining a certain level of education or occupational prestige. Okay? Otherwise, they may live in completely different parts of the country, have different accents, come from different kinds of families, et cetera, et cetera. They're just a statistical collection. Could it be that over time, people who end up by chance in the same rank begin, okay, to acquire properties, cultural properties, ways of talking, ways of carrying yourself, ways of dressing, ways of looking at the world, attitudes, and so on, that makes them look more like a coherent group, like a culture, so that they look like an in-group, and they start identifying themselves with one another and thinking of themselves as a we, distinct from other groups, other in-groups. Right? Weber suggests that's likely to happen. Okay? Especially if that group ends up being closed off from the other groups interactionally, living together in the same areas and so on. Okay, and so this guy, that's kind of my bridge into this work by this fellow here named Basil Bernstein. Basil Bernstein was a sociolinguist. He looked at language and its sociological significance. And this was in Great Britain in the 1950s. In Great Britain in the 1950s, he ended up doing volunteer teaching work among poorer children, the working class children of an area of London that was well known, East London. Okay, and actually there was a lot of kind of what's the word for it? A form of prejudice, class prejudice, the upper class towards the lower classes, the educated classes towards the working classes, and so on. And they even spoke a distinct kind of British, where if you heard it, if you were an upper class British person who spoke like the form of British that had the kind of accents that you get in the good schools, if you hear the accent, you immediately think, oh, yeah, like gutter talk, right? That's bad speech. It's called Cockney. Now, here's what Bernstein actually, from his experience of working in the schools with these working class children, he actually found performance differences, outcome differences between upper class and lower class children. The lower class children tended to underperform their upper class peers in certain domains, especially when it came to use of language, presentations that they had to give, or papers that they had to turn in, and so forth. Okay. But what he did not believe is that these outcome differences could be accounted for by biology, by genetics, by saying that, look, if you're upper class, it's because you got the good genes. If you're lower class, it's because you got the bad genes, and so you're just kind of biologically predestined, okay, to working in the factory rather than, in an ad firm or on, some kind of, investment bank in London, in London's fancier districts. Instead, he said there's a process, a socialization process that's linked to class position. Okay? And if you take a look, here's what he suggests. He suggests that you begin to develop unique communication styles based on where you're located economically, your social class position, your occupation. So here's what he wrote. If you're in the upper strata, by which he means you're in the professional classes, you're a university instructor, you're an investment banker, you're an ad firm person, in the upper tiers of an ad firm or whatever, that Your workplace is one in which you spend a lot of time interacting with people that may come from completely different areas of the country. You travel to conferences, you call people on the phone, clients and competitors and so on. And what that means is that when you communicate with them, you cannot rely on background knowledge, shared experiences. And in fact, much of our communication with many of the people that we know does in fact rely on background knowledge. Okay, so our speech tends to become more abbreviated. We use short terms. We use kind of like coded language to say, let's put it this way, to say a chapter, to say a paragraph in just a few words. Whereas if you are speaking with people with whom you don't have share a lot of background information, you have to spell everything out. And very often when you spell everything out, says Bernstein, when you have to spell everything out, you are encouraged to use a number of grammatical, or what he calls syntactical, it also means grammatical constructions that'll increase your ability to do that, to pack that information in there. So you use things like embedded clauses and other kinds of embedded clauses is a real big one, okay? Longer sentences, more grammatically elaborate. When you, and then he says, now imagine being one of those working class fellows, persons. You work on the factory floor. So you spend all your time together with the same people day in and day out, okay, during the work week. And then in all likelihood, when you go home, your home isn't very far from your workplace, and it's probably located near the homes of your own fellow workers. Your kids probably go to the exact same schools. You probably end up going to the local pub and spending even more time with your coworkers afterwards. And so the idea is that the vast bulk of your communication is undertaken with people who you've come to know extremely intimately, extremely well, so that you know their biography, you know their habits, you know their likes and dislikes and so on. And you've even shared experiences with them in the past. What that means is much of your communication can use shortcuts, abbreviations, right? You can use like nicknames and so on to refer to entire ideas, concepts, references to experiences and so on. Okay. Well, here's what he ends up theorizing. He theorizes that the working class, because of their work situation, end up developing or preferring or practicing what he calls restricted code. That is less fancy talk. It uses less of certain kinds of grammatical mechanisms or constructions, whereas the middle class or upper strata use elaborated codes, and they use more fancy kinds of. Let me finish today by giving you one example that comes directly from him. So imagine that I'm going to ask you guys to do something for me. And so here's my request to Darius or Anna or Katie. Here's my question to you. If you're going into Bedford, could you get a new toy for Rupert the dog from the pet shop, which we can't name because if the dog, wait a second, I'm sorry. I screwed that up. I've been planning that all day and I just messed it up. I'm supposed to ask a different version of that question. So let me stop and let me ask that question again. Anna, Darius, Katie, if you're going to town, could you get Rupert a new April from you-know-where? Repeat that. If you're going to town, could you get Rupert a new April from you-know-where? So here's what you're supposed to observe. You're supposed to observe, first of all, that you understand the sentence. It's like there weren't words in there that you didn't know. I wasn't speaking a foreign language. And yet, there you are. I just asked you to do something, and let's assume you were willing to do that for me, but you absolutely have no idea how you would even begin to do it, right? You're like, yeah, if I'm going to town, get Rupert a new April. Look, you don't know what town, you don't know who the heck Rupert is, you don't know what a new April was, and from you know where, you have no idea, right? And you're like, well, maybe if we knew each other better, I could do it. So that's restricted code. That's an example of restricted code. It's pretty short. Notice it's pretty short. You use kind of, they're like inside jokes or inside references, stuff that had we shared a lot of experiences with each other, you might know how to do. Now, here is elaborated code. Notice, first of all, it's much longer. It packs in all kinds of information. It spells everything out. It gives you definition. So let me explain. If you are going into Bedford, that's the name of the town, or I could say if you're going into Indianapolis, could you please get a new toy for Rupert the dog from the pet shop, which we can't name because if the dog hears it, he'll go mad, right? So that's for from you know where, to replace the one which we have come to call April, which he has almost chewed to bits. So now, if I asked you that, you would stand a better chance of being able to do what I asked, right? If you were willing, right? Because I spelled everything out. So here's what he's saying. Here's what Basil Bernstein is saying. If your job is such that you share enough background experience with people that you could say things like, if you're going to town, get Rupert a new April from you know where. You would be talking that way all the time. That's how you would practice speaking. That's the kind of speaking you would become most proficient and most comfortable in. Whereas if you're speaking to people, okay, clients, customers, distant coworkers in a very large, suppliers of product and going to conferences and so on, where people don't share. You have to spell things out for them. You might start talking a lot more like the second one. If you're going into Bedford, please get a new toy for Rupert the dog from the pet shop. What you notice in there is you're adding prepositional phrases. You're adding all kinds of stuff. And the idea is you would become proficient in that. So here's what he's saying. He's saying that it is true that you acquire certain cultural features. Here, a linguistic style or communicative style, and that becomes distinctive of a class, okay? But not because of biology or genetics, but because, you are socialized within this given kind of class structure, okay? So people end up, and here's the big question, okay? So that Basil Bernstein, very influential sociolinguist regarding class, this whole idea of different communication styles based on class is influential. Not everyone necessarily agrees with it. So you can ask yourself the question, do I think it's true? Maybe it applied in the 1950s, but now because of the leveling or equalizing influence of higher and higher levels of education, maybe it's not nearly so true, neither in the UK, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, nor in the United States. So you might ask yourself, are there still class-related differences in communication styles? Do you observe them? Do you note them? Do they still emerge? Are they still kept around? And if they are, does that play a role? Do communicative styles play a role in people's ability to get ahead or not within a competitive class system? getting certain kinds of jobs and getting into schools and, you know, forming connections that are useful and so forth. I'm actually kind of curious whether anybody thinks that there, do you find it plausible that there are class related communication styles, or doesn't this seem true of the United States? You're thinking, you could think, maybe when Bernstein was looking at this place in London in the late 1950s, yeah, there may have been a clear divide, right, between people who spoke this way and they spoke that way, you know, because of their different kinds of jobs. But here in the United States, no, things are much more fluid. People's communication style seems much less tied to their occupation, the occupation of their parents or their neighborhood or